University is there, and Lindholm from the Oslo Coalition of Freedom of Religion or Belief in the Zoom. And the time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Selamat siang. So I hope you're not too sleepy after lunch. All right, we will start this session entitled Human Rights, History, Concepts, and its Future. Very interesting. I have been following the discussion this morning. So I will check if Pak Tora is here online. Hello. Oh, where should I face? Maybe which direction? Okay. Hello, Pa. How are you?
I'm fine. It's early morning. I'm awake.
Okay. What time is it at your end?
8:11.
Oh, okay. Not too bad. Okay. All right.
Oh, no.
Can I start with Cole first, and then after him, I can give the time to you, and then we will follow up with question and answer. Is that okay?
Definitely.
Okay.
Do you think I can see Cole on this Zoom? I cannot see Cole at this time.
Okay.
Oh yeah, there
he
is.
Okay.
There he is.
Okay.
Fine.
All right. Okay, thank you very much. So, while reading the program for this conference, I found the information that the International Center for Law and Religion Studies and Norwegian partner institutions have actually cooperated in two long-term projects designed to promote familiarity with and scholarly study of the human rights to freedom of religion and belief in Indonesia, where our two presenters this afternoon, Professor Cole-Durham and Tora Lindholm, involved. I learned that the first of the Indonesian projects that both presenters were involved was with the Center for Religious and Socio-Cultural Diversity. That's the name of the center, CRSD, headed by the director, Pak Rifai Abduh, at the State Islamic University Sunan Kalijaga in Yogyakarta, where I was a junior member at that time. So I don't know whether Pak Tore remember, but I was surprised that actually this experience goes back to 15 years ago. And at that time, Professor Durham and Lindholm developed a set of course materials for a master's level law course focusing on the right to freedom of religion or belief in international and comparative constitutional law, and had conducted an intensive pilot course for some 35 students and NGO activists, but you added just before this also for professors, yeah, at the university level. So no wonder I think that these both scholars have been known by Indonesian scholars and activists of freedom on religion and belief. Because already I think at that time you focus also on the dissemination of knowledge, scholarly studies, and also more importantly also on how this is practiced, being practiced, yeah, the practical understanding of the globally acknowledged religious freedom norms. So in light of this background, I would like to briefly introduce our first speaker, Professor Cole-Durham, who is, you can later correct me if I have some wrong information. I mainly gathered your information from online sources. So you are an emeritus professor of law at the Reuben Clark Law School of Brigham Young University. And you are also the founding director of the Law School's International Center for Law and Religious Studies, which is the main supporters for this conference and other programs on freedom of religion and belief at CRCS and ICRS. So thank you very much. And from 2000 to 2016, you are also the director of the center. And from 2011 through 2016, you are also the president of the International Consortium for Law and Religious Studies based in Milan, Italy. So I can go on and on to reading your CV, but we can just now focus on your presentation. This is just to give you a very brief information that Cole does not write a chapter in the book that you have, but on chapter 6, on a chapter written by Brett Scharf, he also wrote a similar topic. So if you would like to consult issues related to this, please go to chapter 6 of the book. So for this session, could you also please briefly share the historical background of the UDHR, your experiences in working with Indonesian institutions, and probably, if the time permits, also for challenges in teaching and promoting human rights in higher education. Please, thank you.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and a pleasure to be here, at least electronically, with Tura. We go back many years in terms of working on these kinds of projects. We talked a little bit briefly. I do have a PowerPoint that basically tracks the chapter in question, and I have to give credit to Brett Scharf because it's a PowerPoint that he basically developed. And I'm not going to use all of it, but I'm going to I'll make some preliminary remarks in response to your question, and then I'll talk about some of the sections, and then you just tell me when to stop, and I'll stop. She needs to do that with both you and me, Tura, because we both could talk for a long time. Let me just say, we come out this focus today is on developing these kind of materials for university environments, and particularly for university environments in Indonesia. But this is part certainly from my perspective and also from Tura's, this goes back to a long partnership on thinking about how one can most effectively facilitate freedom of religion or belief around the world. Tura and I met at a conference organized in Oslo, and that gave birth to the Oslo Coalition and also gave birth to a partnership between the Oslo Coalition and our center, which has led to many projects. But I think you need to understand that these are not just academic projects. They are really rooted in a long-term experience with working on legal change in different systems. I had become in the fall of 1989, I became the secretary of the American Society of Comparative Law. And about 3 weeks later, the wall came down in Berlin. Within a couple of months, we realized there was going to be massive legal transformation all over Eastern Europe. And my position as the secretary of American Society of Comparative Law helped me to be in positions to take a comparative law approach to these changes. A lot of the projects were being funded by the American Bar Association in the United States or by the Council of Europe or the European Union in Europe. And one of the things that I worked on was bringing together people from multiple systems so that as we would get word from a particular parliament that they were working on a law on a specific issue, and we would tap our resources of comparative law scholars, both in Europe and in the United States, so that as we met with people working on their legal changes, they would have access to real expertise on what was happening in legal settings. Now, this turned out to be extremely effective. One of the things that came out of the initial conference where Tura and I met was the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is the links about 50. It basically is the countries of the North except for Japan. And it brought us together to work on change that was going on. The biggest changes were going on in Central Asia and Eastern Europe, but we had many chances to work on and to develop materials. And I had long been someone who taught in the academia courses on religion and the state. And so when changes for law reform in those areas came along, that's what I worked on. And then as we met in Norway in 1999, 1998, 1999, we started realizing the need for materials to help train. I mean, we were thinking at that point of what we've learned from training new governments that were going through profound legal change. But as we thought about it, one of the things we needed was a desk book that could be used by all kinds of people who were working in the area. The joke is that this became so thick ultimately that what we envisioned as a sort of a handbook for use on people's desks became itself a desk. It was so thick. But it remains something that's a very useful overview of the kinds of issues that people face in dealing with freedom of religion or belief. But then as the Oslo Coalition was formed, we started thinking about how do we do this, how do we share knowledge in these areas, in other areas. I mean, in a way, what we were really doing, I think, is helping to construct the field of international religious freedom law and thinking about how that gets structured, how one does it academically, how one trains government officials, how one trains human rights workers, how one trains NGOs. And so we've been coming at this from a very broad perspective, but in a critical way, universities and the university setting is particularly important because, as Lena Larson talked about this morning, there is something about the academic setting that gives you a kind of independence and a kind of credibility that can really build the knowledge base that is necessary for meaningful understanding and law reform. Now, what are the problems? Well, one problem I had was I was American. And that meant, and this is a problem, I mean, I think it's sort of a good thing, actually. I mean, I like being an American, but the problem is, if you're working on law reform, everyone you meet suspects you have a hidden agenda. And so you spend the first 3 conferences trying to persuade people that you're not intentionally trying to be a neo-colonialist, and by the 4th and 5th conference, you deconstruct yourself so you really are honest in not being a neo-colonialist. But that's an issue, because anytime you work in any area, and this was true in Eastern Europe, it's true in Latin America, Africa, it's true here, people have this initial suspicion that you're hitting them with a juggernaut of ideas that seems to be foreign and to come from someplace else. Whereas I think from our perspective, it is there are sets of ideas that we share as human beings and rights we have because we are human beings that we can learn from and understand. The fact that these rights are universal doesn't mean they'll be applied in exactly the same way in every context. One of the things we've learned as we've worked on materials, we've developed ultimately a case book that we use that's been used in many countries around the world now for teaching issues of freedom of religion or belief. There are a lot of American cases because the book gets sold in America, in the United States, what can I say? But there are a lot of European court cases because the European Court of Human Rights is an instrumental model. So these are clearly Western models, but one of the things we know is that as we do courses or training anyplace else, we have to find out what the cases that are the real cases you're dealing with in your countries are, and then look at those problems. Because what's really universal is the problems. The problems, they have different names, involve different people, different groups, but they're similar in structure. And so one of the things we've found ourselves doing is trying to find ways to share information about these sort of deeply human problems that we all share, and none of us have perfect solutions. But one of the things that I want to start out saying is that the approach has been a comparative law approach. Now, sometimes people think of comparative law as a kind of comparative social engineering. But the reality is comparative law is more like heart transplant surgery. That is, you're dealing with something that is very organic, that is very sensitive to the culture in which you're working. It's very likely that as you try to do a transplant, you can get allergic reactions. And there are a whole set of issues that come about sharing ideas about some of the things and sharing the learning we've had in other cultures, trying to figure out how best to adapt that to other cultures and make sure that we don't get allergic reactions, or try to avoid that. As we have worked in this area, one of the things that's become very clear is that one of the very powerful tools we have is the body of international human rights norms that has emerged and that's been time-tested and has a kind of credibility around the world. People will raise questions about whether the Universal Declaration is really universal, etc. But in many ways, it's now 70 years old. It's really been time-tested. Some of the key norms, we know a lot about how they work, what makes them work, and what doesn't work. Now, let me just say that one of the things that happens with respect to allergic reactions is that there is this tendency to see a tension. It's been characterized here as a tension between Sharia and human rights, between Islamic law and human rights. The more I have lived with this, I realize that this is something that people here experience, that is something that those of us in the United States or Europe experience in a very similar way. That is, there is a version of international human rights law which is sort of intentionally very secular in its orientation. And if you're a religious believer, you experience it initially as an attack on religious traditional things that you take for granted. And so it seems like an imperialist force. I remember when I was working on the Constitution in Iraq, I would tell people I live in one of the few places in the United States that's been invaded by the US Army because my religious community was unpopular and got attacked. But the point is, what we're dealing with here is something deeper. You can think of it in a number of different ways. We're dealing with forces that came from the Enlightenment, but there are two different versions. There was the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The American Revolution tended to be very religion-friendly. The French Revolution ended up being an attack in many ways, or it was experienced certainly by the Catholic Church as an attack on traditional religious values. And only in the 20th century, with the Vatican II, did Catholicism take the position that religious freedom was not anathema, was not. In the 19th century, it was viewed as a sort of a false teaching. So I want to just point out that tension that gets felt in this country in the form of tension between Sharia and human rights is something that is experienced more generally as different encounters with different versions of the Enlightenment, or another way of stating it, there are different versions of secularization. There is secularism as an ideology, which ends up being inconsistent in a number of ways with religious belief, and there is secularity as a kind of legal framework that seeks to accommodate religious beliefs, secular beliefs, and a wide range of things. And part of what we hope is happening is what we see happening in part by sharing the learning of the book that's just been published, is that this is a way of helping people to see freedom of religion and human rights more generally, not as an attack on traditional values, but as a bulwark that can protect all kinds of people, prevailing religions, minority religions, non-religions, and so it's very broad, but it's very important that people be able to understand that that's the real power behind these ideas. Well, there were some other things that I would say, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to touch bases on a few things. And now I don't know how yes, okay, so I can share my screen. It's up on the screen. So I'm just going to share a few of the slides from this program. Now let me see. Oh, wait a minute. I've got to watch over there. Okay. Nope, it's not changing. I'm clicking.
Yeah.
It's working? Okay.
Yes. It's
But
working.
The color is not very good. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, this may be a problem. Let's see. The real problem is it's not going to the ones. It doesn't change when I want it to.
Sure.
Okay. So you can see this. So well, I'm just going to look at this. So this is a famous quote from Marianne Glendon's book on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if you're interested in in-depth background on what happened, this is a really wonderful book. But she quotes this wonderful statement: "The moral terrain of international relations was forever altered late one night in Paris on December 10th, stretching into the night of December 11th, when the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights." This document has really become, it's a declaration, so it's not technically law, but it's become accepted as customary law. It is the customary law of international human rights. Now, what's interesting from our perspective here is just to understand a little bit of how this came about. And now I don't know. Which way do I do it? Okay, so skip forward. Let me see what happens, because the clicker's not working. So one of the questions that people ask here is how universal was I'll call it the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's important to understand that it was undertaken at the insistence of small countries. It was not just the big Western powers. Indeed, if anything, and let's see, so go forward. This is a problem because your version does not skip the slides. So go forward. This is going to help. They're not skipping. I will skip. Go forward. So it was drafted in 1945. Go back. I really need to be able to control this. It's very annoying. So one of the things that's really important to understand for the purposes of understanding the nature of the UDHR is that it was not something that the great powers imposed. In fact, the great powers had relatively little interest. They had pursued the Second World War and said this was the war for democracy and human rights and so forth. But when they got to the end of it, the United States had racism at home. It wasn't too interested in human rights. The British Empire was still the British Empire, and it was still a colonial power. I mean, I could go through the other major powers, but it was really in many ways other smaller countries that really pushed for what became the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay, skip. Skip. Now, one of the things that was going on at the time was that people were starting to see the appalling pictures of genocide. The Holocaust, the massacre of 6 million Jews and other small groups as well. And this had a haunting impact on international thinkers and national thinkers everywhere. And this was the real background against which the modern human rights movement emerged. But it was not exactly some sort of intellectual construct aimed at enforcing power. It was just an intense moral reaction to the horrors of what had happened and a desire to say never again. Now, unfortunately, we keep having to say never again because these things keep happening. But that's the background. Let's see, go to the next slide. This is a list of the countries who were involved in the Commission of Human Rights at the time. Now, it's true that at the time, the total membership of the United Nations was relatively small. I don't remember the exact number, something like 47 countries.
52.
How many, Tura?
52. 52.
52. Okay, so I was within 5. But if you look at this, you have Australia, you have some European countries, you had some East European countries, you had Philippines, you had some Central American countries, Panama, you had Uruguay, Latin America, you had India, Iran, China. You had countries really from all over the world, from the different civilizational backgrounds. And, you know, if you had wanted to pick a fairly diverse group at the time to make this, to start creating the Universal Declaration, it would have been hard to do something that would have been more diverse than that. Okay, let's go forward. Eleanor Roosevelt was elected as the chair. There was an 18-member delegation. Skip forward. There are some key people: Charles Malik of Lebanon, P.C. Chang from China, John Humphrey from Canada, who had prepared a sort of a comparative law table of what all the constitutions around the world protected as rights. Eleanor Roosevelt, also the French scholar René Cassin. My French is bad. And this is just sort of laying out who they were. P.C. Chang and Charles Malik were philosophers. René Cassin was a very prominent legal expert. And then Eleanor Roosevelt had been the wife of the U.S. president, but also was really a major force on her own. Okay, let's go forward. So what's interesting, and I think maybe I'll just say some things briefly here and then not worry about the slides. This group was actually very diverse, and it took quite a while for them to be able to move forward and work together because they didn't have shared ideas. And one of the things that turned out to be very helpful is the idea of dignity, which had been mentioned in the charter, and P.F. Chang mentioned that idea, and that became a kind of core notion around which consensus could emerge. And I know we at our center have sort of gone back to thinking about this in intense ways after 70 years because dignity remains to this day a kind of concept which different people agree with in principle. Now, they may come at it from different perspectives. There is a very sharp, very significant concept of dignity in Islamic law. It's a Christian idea. It is, we're told that it is right at the heart of the Confucian tradition. It's an idea that, because of its power, people from different perspectives try to capture it, but it in some ways is a non-capturable notion. That is, it has a kind of upward trajectory. It is an objective that things are pointed toward. It is a criterion of whether things are going well, whether you've got the right principles in place, if dignity is respected. So the emergence of this made possible a kind of consensus. I mean, if you, people would often say that they were able to get consensus if they had tried to explain why they had consensus. They could not have agreed on the explanations, but they were able to agree on consensus because there was this kind of common respect for the idea of dignity. What then happened was they ultimately came out with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted unanimously with a few abstentions from the communist and the Islamic world. And from the Islamic world, the issue was this change of religion, which was one of the key notions in the Article 18 of the Universal Declaration. What did Muslim countries thinking about the right to change religions? And that's been tinkered with and doctored with in subsequent documents. But it remains a very powerful notion, because it's in some ways hard to imagine you really have full freedom of religion if you can't change your religion. Now, if you're a Muslim and within the Muslim world, and you say, can Muslim law say that you can't change your religion? Well, you know, for any religious organization says it's impermissible as a matter of religious law to change from that religion. But it's a different issue when you're asking about whether you have freedom of religion or belief, because then you're talking about not about life within the religious community, but life in the world where you're living with other people. Now, I'm not going to go into more detail. I've probably already taken too much time. But let me just say this. One of the things we know is that the notion of freedom of religion or belief, and more generally human rights, these are tools that have incredible power in helping to make it possible for life to exist in peace in very pluralistic communities. Whatever else we know about the world, whether it be life in Indonesian society, life in United States society, life in European society, life in African society. I've worked in all of these contexts, and there are none of them where there is a nice, handy, convenient, happy harmony on all issues. People are different. Most families are different. I've got grandchildren who disagree with my religious beliefs. This happens. This is part of life. And one of the real challenges, and something I'm really indebted to Ture Lindholm for helping to work out, what you need for stability is not homogeneity. Indeed, one of the things that can really trigger violence is if you have a centralizing power that tries to force everyone to be the same. You will really get people to react to that. And when you're dealing with religious issues, it's particularly dangerous, because religion is one of the few things that people care about more than life itself. And so if you push them into a corner on their religious beliefs, they will fight back. I mean, there are a few people that will turn the other cheek and turn over and die, but in general, this is a recipe for violence. The recipe for peace and stability is developing principles where there's sort of mutual assured respect. And that's what freedom of religion or belief is ultimately about. It's about saying, whatever your beliefs are, whether they're secular beliefs, religious beliefs, Muslim beliefs, Christian beliefs, you will be protected in our society because we have this fundamental human right to dignity, and dignity means that we can choose our religious orientations, we can live according to our beliefs. And if you have that kind of trust, that others will also respect those kind of principles, that's the recipe for stability in a plural society. Now, there will be situations where people want to engage in violence or want to impose their views by violence, or they will fight, or freedom of religion or belief is not an absolute right. And one of the powerful things that was worked out, beginning with the UDHR and certainly in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, is very careful, refined thinking about when it is that other considerations justify overriding freedom of religion. But if those are very carefully constrained, what you have is a tool, a filtering mechanism that can help move the positive things that religion does in society forward, while creating some control for the dark side of religion, which is there. I mean, there are some problems. But if that balance can be pursued correctly, or in a balanced way, in a wise way, then you can achieve social peace, and the social capital of human society is unleashed. And that's what we've been trying to work through now. And coming back to the theme of this session and this conference, it's particularly critical for people in universities to be educated and to understand how this works. Because freedom of religion or belief, for example, is paradoxical. It's odd in a way, because it means you have to respect the rights of others to have beliefs that you deeply disagree with. So it's paradoxical. Yeah. But if you understand how it works, and if you understand the empirical evidence that is there now for it working, this can be extremely powerful. And policy planners in government, politicians, if there is solid academic understanding, this is critical. This is why we've worked to help develop and train professors. We have programs on for young professors, and you also have to think about how in this country, how do you get these notions to be shared so that there will not be an allergic reaction from the Muslim world, because these ideas in the end can be harmonized with some of the deepest resources within the Muslim tradition and within the other traditions that are here in Indonesia. So that's a little history, why we're involved. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Cole. Yeah, I think you have underlined many important points. The long partnership with Tora, who will be speaking soon after this. But also, I think one thing that interesting is the challenges that you mentioned about that you being suspected as an American, having allergic reaction from other people. But while at the same time, people also in the U.S., as some people, maybe some groups of people, as you mentioned, in the U.S. have also allergic reaction when when we're talking about the interaction of the relationship between human rights and religion. So yeah, it's quite interesting. So it's not
shared universal problems.
Yeah. All right. So I will not summarize, but I will now introduce our second presenter, Professor Tora Lindholm. Who is an emeritus professor at the Norwegian Center for Human Rights, Faculty of Law, University of Oslo, and also is also a board member of the Oslo Coalition on Freedom of Religion or Belief. Also is an academic advisory board member of the International Center, mentioned a few times today, for Law and Religious Studies at BYU, and member on Human Rights Committee of Church of Norway. So for today's session, in addition to speaking about the conceptual underpinning and public grounds for human rights, if possible, could you also highlight some experiences and the changes that you have observed throughout the years, especially in working with Indonesian educational institutions? And one more question from me, maybe that if the time permits, since in your chapter in the book, you also discuss international human rights across the different creeds, cultures, and doctrines. And I see that this is in line with our today's discussion, especially by some of our Muslim presenters' friends this morning, who face challenges also in their classrooms, as discussed, when teaching courses related to religion and human rights, and also in bringing up the issue of human rights within Indonesian Islamic context, which is diverse. So you have maximum 20 minutes, and I will remind you if like the time, like 5 minutes left, please.
I have the floor? Yes. Yes. I can start, huh?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. And thank you, Cole, for excellent, a little long talk, very good talk. So I'll try to be short, which is very difficult, as you may realize. I will try to go through the topics of the paper, of the chapter in the book, chapter 7 in the book, that is now being launched. And I have the great pleasure and honor and joy to say that I have been looking forward to this conference, started in Malang and now in Yogyakarta, the launching of the book that we have been working on literally for more than 10 years. So when I now go through my chapter in that book, which is what I'm asked to do in part, I will try to show also where I think I have developed since I wrote the chapter 5 years ago. First, I will just say that I raised the issue of the first page of the book. Can we have a short description, a short formula for what are human rights? My answer in the text is this: human rights are publicly recognized entitlements that in our world, only to the extent, of course, it is in fact observed, these rights help safeguard human beings everywhere against certain more or less severe social or natural threats and perils. Human rights are protective devices for all human beings against threats and perils, dangers. Now I would add, human rights are also to be seen as vehicles or instruments of solidarity, a solidarity across all humankind. This was conceived as such in the beginning of the Universal Declaration. Cole mentioned the foundation of human rights in belief in human dignity. All human beings have dignity. What exactly is dignity? What are the grounds of dignity? Well, as a Christian, I believe, I'm a Lutheran Christian, evangelical Christian. I believe we are endowed with the message from God. We are created in God's image. But I'm coming into this later on. If I were a Muslim, I would certainly believe in the karama, which is translated as dignity. There is no word for dignity in the Bible, but there is a word for dignity in the Quran, in the Holy Quran, namely karama. This, so I think that, but if I were as Cole mentioned, if I were a Confucian thinker, I would also believe in human dignity of everyone. The point about dignity of human being is each human being is included. Not just the saints, not just men, not just believers, but people who are sinners, people who are not very pious. It is enough to be a human being to have dignity. There is something you should always avoid doing to any human being, if she is a human being, etc. So my answer to what are human rights is they are vehicles or instruments of universal solidarity. How come? That is what I'm going to address a few minutes now. In my chapter, I present an overview of the basic concepts and features you need to understand human rights norms. And one thing is that human rights are, no, big surprise, they are rights. Briefly said, I think rights are relationships between holders of rights and the addressees of the obligations to respect the rights. And this idea of solidarity feature of human rights is that all human beings are also addressees of human rights. We, each one of us, have a duty, according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to respect human rights. But of course, most of us are not police. We are not judges. We are not the legal system. So the way for a modern society to organize this relationship between people, between all human beings, is via the legal institution that we have, the apparatus of law and justice. And I think I will not say much more about that because it takes too much time. Just one thing in my chapter, I list a number of human rights benefits, goods, which are to be protected for every human being. It's a list of 40 concerns. Please look at it. And when you use this list as a teacher, you may ask, is that all? No, because there are more concerns, more controversial concerns too, that have been included later on. But these are the classical concerns of human rights protection. To be protected by law, it is freedom of religion, yes, but it is also freedom of minorities, minority cultures, minority languages, minority religions. They are special protection for children, There's special protection for women, and protection against racial and religious hatred, discrimination, and their protection against torture and cruelty against humans. All of these things are covered by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the basic instruments with which the human rights movement after World War II started out. What I now really would like to focus on is what I was invited to do by the chair, namely, what are the public foundations of international law? Here I want to be look into the history of the Universal Declaration. You see, when the Charter of the United Nations was established in San Francisco, in California, in early summer 1945, very many groups, participating countries, small countries, Latin American countries, the few countries that had come out of the hardship of colonial subjugation, they wanted human rights to be spelled out in the Charter. But that was impossible. The great powers, the United States of America, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, they did not want human rights to be spelled out in the Charter of the United Nations. And we have a saying in Norway, my country, when the devil wants nothing to happen, he appoints a committee. Nothing to happen. Well, it is in the rhyme in Norwegian. So they established a committee, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. It was appointed at the very end of 46, and it worked until the end of 1948, now 74 years ago. And this commission, Cole has mentioned them. He has mentioned some of the most important names, and I shall repeat some of those names. They worked against very hard odds, against finding a conception of concerns of protection for all human beings that could be agreed upon across the board, across ideological, cultural, and economic huge differences at the time. So in my chapter, I spell out what I think are the tremendous obstacles against success for this Human Rights Committee of the United Nations. The main obstacles were, in my view, three. First, there was a huge obstacle to having universal agreement that the great powers, I mentioned them, they all had what we could call human rights corpses in their closets. You know, to have a corpse in the closet means to have something really bad which you don't want out publicly recognized and discussed. And in the United States, it was a racial segregation, which would not square at all with universal human rights. In the Soviet Union and in its area, it was a subjugation of colonial people and of minority nationalities. For Great Britain, for France, and for the Netherlands, don't forget the Netherlands, you're in Indonesia, for Belgium, for Portugal, they didn't want to have these colonial peoples be elevated to a level of protection of the human beings there at the same level as in the mother country. So there was a resistance on colonialist, imperialist grounds against universal human rights. Objection or obstacle number two was that there was, in fact, of course, great, and there still are great discrepancies of culture, of creed, of political system, of economic development between different peoples in the world. So there was a legitimate resistance against what was seen at the time, and still is seen at against illegitimate homogenization of the entire post-World War II world in the image of certain hegemonic states. One was against illegitimate homogenization, culturally, religiously, and so on. The third issue the third obstacle against universal human rights was this idea that you should have worldwide, some kind of worldwide implementation, or at least respect, policing of human rights across the board, because that goes against the sacred idea of state sovereignty. Each state should be sovereign, and you should not have opened the door to criticism, intervention across state borders. So these were the three obstacles against having universal human rights. Protection of each and every human being in all countries at some equal level of protection.
Excuse me, but 5 more minutes, please.
Okay, fine, thank you. And I just want to say that the fantastic thing that this Commission of the United Nations on human rights succeeded in was to have a conclusion adopted unanimously without any opposing votes in the General Assembly, that you could have universally approved, universally accepted standards of protection of each and every human being. How did they do that? Well, let's take them one by one. The three obstacles that I mentioned to you. The obstacle of colonialism, imperialism, was very hard to conquer. So what they did was to say that, and if you read in the text from 1948 of the Universal Declaration, it says that in the preamble, it says, all peoples and all nations are to, by progressive measures, to secure universal and effective recognitions and observance of human rights, both among people of the members of the UN and among people of territories under their jurisdiction. I repeat, people in colonial territories under the imperialist colonial control, they also have a right to human rights. It says in the preamble of the text. And now I remind you, Indonesians, that this was the formula in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was very effectively used at the Bandung Conference. You know, the Bandung Conference on African and Asian solidarity in 1954-55. So there was an opening. How did the Commission of Human Rights construe human rights so that they would not interfere unduly with differences of culture and creed and political system? Well, in my view, we may disagree on this, the rights of each and every human being in the Universal Declaration, they can be characterized as they protect a decent minimum, and they're sort of down to earth. They are not very high-level dreams for everybody. No, they are down to earth if you look at it. And this you should do with your students when you go through this. And finally, how about the conflict between universal jurisdiction, ideally, of protection of human rights, and state sovereignty? I read from the text. The United Nations Charter, it contains a stark tension between regulations of state. It foresees that all states should have perfect sovereignty. No state should be legitimate in interfering in other states' affairs. But then it says, in Article 55 and 56 of the Charter of the United Nations, it says, the United Nations shall promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. And it says, and here I quote from the Charter of the United Nations, all members pledge themselves to take joint and separate action in cooperation with the organization for the achievement of the purposes set forth in Article 55 that I just read to you. So you have a kind of ambiguous working out of a compromise between state sovereignty on the one side and universal, legitimate universal, not jurisdiction, the lawyer would say, but certainly a legitimate claim to promote freedom of human rights everywhere, across borders. I now come to the last point that I was asked to address, which really interests me. But I want to say this about the members of the Commission of Human Rights, 1940, who reached this conclusion by 1948. And it was a Chinese member, a Buddhist, no, he was a Buddhist. There was a Confucian thinker, Peng Chong-chang. He protested against what Westerners, in his view, tried to do when they said that the foundation for human rights shall be they are endowed by God or by the Creator or by nature with dignity. And he says that if you insist on sticking to your metaphysics, to your theology, the world, non-Western world cannot go on. And therefore, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does not give God, Allah, an official role in protecting human rights. It is done in terms of universal human dignity. And that was acceptable to Confucians, to Buddhists, to Christians, to Jews, and to atheists. Now, how about this religious interest of mine, which is more strong now than it was when I wrote my chapter, and that is the idea that you have grounds for accepting human dignity, deserving protection of human rights across the board, across religious divides. Here I do believe that we do have in the Holy Quran, and here my advisor is Professor Muhammad Hashim Kamali, who has written a beautiful little book on the Islamic view of universal human dignity. So he quotes from Surah 17, Ayat 70, which in his English interpretation runs like this, and I quote, "And surely we," God speaking in the divine plural, "we have bestowed dignity, karama, on the children of Adam, and we carry them in the hands, in the land, carry them in the land and the sea, and we have given them of good things, and we have made them to excel by an appropriate excellence over most of those things we have created," quote, end of quote. And another Quranic proof of the dignity of human beings is from Surah 20, Ayat 30. And I like that very much. It says, and I quote, "And when your Lord said to the angels, I am going to place in the earth a Khalif, they said," the angel said, "What? Wilt thou place in it such as shall make mischief in it and shed blood? And we celebrate thy praise and extol thy holiness?" He said, "Surely I know what you do not know." End of quote.
Excuse me, Pa.
I have one more minute and then I'm finished. It is this. How about Buddhists and Buddhism? I have been working with the head of the Norwegian Buddhists now for 6 years and teaching human rights in Myanmar at Buddhist universities. And so my friend have helped me understand what the Buddha sayings, what are their contributions to human dignity. Very briefly, in the continual reincarnation, which Buddhists take for granted, only if you are reborn as a human being, you have access to peace, to justification, to the aim of getting out of the circle, so to say, which is for Buddhists the main thing. So in Buddhism, and of course in Christianity, and in Confucianism, and in Islam, as I understand it, from the help of my friend, there is respect, divine or religious ground for respect of human dignity across the board. How about people who don't believe in religion? There are many people who are atheists or agnostics. Well, I think that if you follow secular philosophy, take Kant, you can say that the only living thing about all created living animals on earth, only human beings are animals, so to say, who have moral responsibility for their own action, responsibility for their own action. This is the beginning, not end. And I'm not giving you a good solution of this. I am only 81 years old, so I think I continue hoping to live for another few years and contribute more to how different worldviews, different religions, each on their own ground,
Amen,
accept equal dignity of all human beings at the basic level. This is to be discussed in class, I hope.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your attention. And sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing many important points. And if you are interested, the article in the book is very good. I have read very briefly. But also thanks for sharing the obstacles. During lunch, we talked briefly about some also challenges, right? And how grateful we are that the UDHR, I always think in Bahasa Indonesia, the abbreviation, still exists after more than 70 years, right? Yeah. All right, we don't actually have much time because I've been told by the committee that we should stop at 2:30 sharp because the next session will have, I don't remember who is the name, but someone who is, who is, has a limited time. So we have about 10 minutes for question and answers, and I have been reminded that we have also audience online. So maybe if there is a question from online audience, no? Okay. So maybe I will just take two. Okay. One from here. Yeah, in the front. Sorry, Whitney. And maybe, okay, one from here, Mas Simbolon. Yeah, please. One from here first, yes. Can you please introduce your name and short question, please?
Hello, can you hear me? Yep. My name is Tiddy Smith. I'm just wanting to ask about heart transplants. So the point that you made, the metaphor that you gave was very interesting about a heart transplant and allergic reaction. But at first I thought this was a very good metaphor, but then, of course, like all metaphors, when you start to analyse it, it wanes under that light. And I thought, well, you said it's undesirable. We don't really, want to import some laws that will result in an allergic reaction. And then I wondered, well, what counts as an allergic reaction? Because almost any law change that might come about will get some negative reaction from some portion of the population. So, are we talking an allergic reaction in terms of resentment, irritation, anger, violence, overthrow of the government? I mean, and so it seems that the more important point is at what level you'd call it an undesirable allergic reaction, or one that's not actually worth the cost, or whatever the benefit is, rather, of changing that law. So I'm wondering if you have some idea of where that line might be. Thank you.
Thank you. I will take the second question. Mas Badri, please.
Yes. Thank you, Bu Fatimah. Dear Prof. Cole and Tour.
A bit louder, maybe, so that others can.
Yeah, just very short question about universality and particularity of the human right. I just tried to take the note, but I didn't get it up. Please, if you have, to explain that. So, for example, to extend the particularity of the human right, can we understand to match it with the universality of the human right? So I think this is a very special issue in us here. Thank you.
Did you get the question? He was asking about the particularity and universality of human rights. So but maybe one, and then I can give the second question.
So let me thank you for picking apart the analogy. Let me just, and I think the point is a good one. I think part of the way I use that analogy is there's a lot of work that's been done in comparative law. I mean, there's some books written on comparative law as legal transplants, because the truth is laws, for the most part, don't get created ab initio. They get created by looking at other countries, looking at other laws, and this is true of constitutions, all of these things. And I'm not sure where the exact line is, but what I guess point one is that it is possible to do the transplants. That is, it's not obviously impossible, and that is that there is. It's just that I think the point is you have to be careful to be sensitive to what is different in the different culture, where you may get strong resistance. I mean, there may be, and that may call for accommodations. But the point is, you can't just copy a law. You can't just do the reading. You have to know more about the history. You have to know more about the religious and cultural background. You have to think about what the consequences are. It's hard to see all the unanticipated consequences, and in a way, I think what you were suggesting is that at a certain point, the transplant simply won't work because you have so much resistance, and you have to judge that. And you basically have to judge that on the basis of local knowledge, and also. But the point of the analogy is not to suggest a bright line of exactly where it works or where it doesn't, but that you have to approach it with the care that physicians would of thinking about all the things that could go wrong and try and minimize those. So that doesn't exactly answer your question, but yeah.
Yeah. Would you like to respond to the second question?
Okay. Yeah, I have to admit I'm not exactly sure that I understand the second question.
You are asking about the universality and particularity of human rights? Yes.
So how to mix it up when we, for example,
How to
I think this, for example, the case of abortion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So for Catholic teaching, for example, we deny abortion.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of abortion, so for the Catholic teaching, we said that we deny abortion from the fetus, from the first time the sperm and the ovarium met.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no abortion at all. Was a law for that. But from the universality, yeah, we still have allow it to make abortion based on the duration of the fetus. So how about how to match the universality and the particularity of the human right here?
So I want to quote him and say I don't know the answer. No, but I do think that everyone understands that as a factual matter, things aren't universal. Nothing gets applied perfectly and so forth. But I do think that there's a notion that the basic human rights have universal application in the sense that they suggest the normative direction in which one should go. Now there are some. I mean, there are controversial questions. So you've raised a very controversial question. That is, when does life begin? When does personhood begin? How does one decide these kind of issues? I think one of the points about the basic human rights is that the basic ones are envisioned as things that could be applied anywhere. Any human being who's alive and can assert these kind of rights. And people have these rights not because the states give them to them, but because they are human beings. But this does not, like the transplant problem. The transplant problem is, in a way, the problem of how universal things are. If things were truly universal, there would be just one cog that would fit in every social machine, and it's not quite like that. There is a universal problem. There is a universal need to wrestle with this problem, but different cultures may apply things in somewhat different ways, and so that has to be taken into account.
Yeah. Very briefly, I think I will give the time also to Pak Tora to respond maybe to the second question about the universality and particularity of human rights? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm ready to give a short reply to that one. The Catholic doctrine is very clear. The fetus has what we would call human rights protection from its inception. But that is not clear from the Universal Declaration or from human rights. The only obvious being when we have a woman who has a future human being in her belly, so to say, is the woman herself. The future mother is very clearly a human being. Whether the fetus is a human being from the moment of is not said in international universal human rights. It does say so in the American, in the inter-American human rights doctrine. I happen to disagree with Cole on this, I believe, because Cole seems to think that from the inception, a fetus has a status as a human being to be protected. I think very clearly only the mother, the future mother, is a human being. It is a very tricky question. What should be the human rights protection of the fetus? In my view, there should be protection of the life of a future human being, of the fetus. But it is not at the level of the human being, the dignity of the mother. And when there is a conflict, the human rights, the worldwide human rights does not give a clear answer. I advise anybody interested in this issue, and I think we all are, to study the discussion in German jurisdiction. The German approach seems to be that the fetus should be protected by the law, but in Germany it is not a crime to have abortion. Somehow they have made the solution there. To me, it shows how difficult the issue is. And the obvious human rights answer is actually, it's not that only the fetus should be protected when there is a conflict with the life of the fetus and the life of the pregnant mother. So this is an issue left to national domestic law to be figured out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's give applause for our two presenters. I don't think I will say much more on this, but I agree with what is written in the program term of reference, that a consensus on this issue is not actually the main point, the main issue, but there is a need for continuous discussion. So let's continue discussing and use, I think, the materials in the book. Very good articles have already been written, and let's share our knowledge on this issue. Thank you very much again, and I give the time back to Mas Heri. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we do not have much time in this session, but thank you for insightful understanding of human rights felt within this session. Moving right along to the fourth session with the theme, 4, freedom of religion or belief and other rights. I would like to invite Ibu Huria from University of Indonesia as moderator, and I invite 3 speakers. First, Brad Scrub from Brigham Young University. Second, Lena Larson from the Oslo Coalition of Freedom of Religion or Belief.